The final big plays are being made in F1's extraordinary 2025 driver market. The second seat at Audi-owned Sauber has finally been filled, but there are still 2 seats at 2 Red Bull teams up for grabs, although that's also close to being finalised, with only 3 more races to go in 2024. There's also a potential curveball within that, as Red Bull's interest in Franco Colapinto is even greater than we first thought. Stick around for that later in this video. First, let's address the completed lineup for whatever Sauber's called in 2025, before the full-blown Audi era begins in 2026, because it's been confirmed Brazilian rookie Gabriel Bortoleto will replace Valtteri Bottas and partner Nico Hülkenberg. The Formula 2 points leader emerged as a strong contender for the seat during the second half of 2024, once Mattia Binotto came on board to lead the Audi F1 project. A firm move for Bortoleto has taken time to come together. Apart from the fact Binotto initially wasn't sure whether youth or experience was the right choice, another complication was Bortoleto's status as a McLaren junior. Signing him required an agreement to either release him from his McLaren deal or for Sauber to accept he'd only join on loan. That wasn't desirable for obvious reasons. Why train a driver up for someone else, especially when you're building a long-term manufacturer project? The same was true of Williams junior Colapinto, who Sauber had some contact with but opted not to pursue. Once the Bortoleto interest solidified though, which meant passing over the likes of ex-Haas driver Mick Schumacher, it was necessary to agree a clean break, which McLaren is willing to allow. While McLaren is believed to rate Bortoleto highly and is pleased with his progress since working with the team on the simulator and in some private testing in an old car, it has no space for him in its F1 team for the foreseeable future, because Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri are both on long-term deals. McLaren didn't want to deny Bortoleto the chance to get on the grid somewhere else. Negotiations progressed and were concluded prior to the Brazilian Grand Prix. Audi says that there is a generational shift occurring in F1, and in Bortoleto, it believes it has secured one of the top talents of the future. Bottas had been led to believe he was in a strong position to renew at Sauber, but was left in the dark for quite some time now, and by the end of the Brazil weekend had not been told of Sauber's decision. He finally learned his fate in the days afterwards, with Sauber formally confirming his and Zhou Guanyu's exits on Wednesday after Brazil, and Bortoleto's confirmation followed shortly after. It's been a strange year for one of the grid's most successful drivers. Bottas began the season with one boss that didn't want him, then got another that maybe did, but who then presumably decided actually he didn't want Bottas after all. The fact this was all so prolonged cast obvious doubt over how serious Bottas's chances really were, even though we understand terms of a deal had been agreed. It's been a confusing situation. Why wait unless the preference was to try to extract Bortoleto from McLaren? But if the preference was always Bortoleto, why has it taken so long to resolve, given McLaren has been willing to release Bortoleto for a while as long as he went straight into a 2025 race seat? It indicates the decision makers at Sauber, which means Binotto and the Audi board, were not completely aligned on what to do. There are strong suggestions that signing Bortoleto was quickly agreed as the right move, but the timing was being disputed. Bring him in immediately for 2025 as a learning year, even if it's spent at the back of the grid, or wait until 2026 when Audi's takeover and rebrand is complete. Maybe that's why Bottas was being told a 2025 deal was on the cards. Maybe the new Sauber Audi F1 management doubted the previous regime's signing of Nico Hülkenberg. One theory is that Binotto would be open to Bottas and Hülkenberg being together next year, but knows that won't work longer term, given they are both in their late 30s and towards the end of their F1 careers. If Sauber deferred Bortoleto's arrival, it could have evaluated which of Hülkenberg or Bottas should be the team's experienced hand beyond 2025, but Hülkenberg is meant to be on a fixed 3-year contract, so it would be expensive and impractical to try to undo that, even if someone wanted to. Whatever the realities of why this has played out in the confusing way it has, Bottas is now facing a season on the sidelines, with a Mercedes reserve driver role now his most likely way of staying connected to F1. Both he and Mercedes are open to that, as they parted on good terms when Mercedes finally put George Russell in the main team for 2022, and Bottas sought a longer-term deal at Alfa Romeo Sauber. By returning to Mercedes, the intention for Bottas will be to try to get back onto the grid in 2026, rather than accept his Grand Prix career is over. Now let's get into Red Bull, the story that keeps on giving despite having Max Verstappen's teammate Sergio Perez under contract until the end of 2026. It's no secret Red Bull wants to drop Perez, who has not been able to address his poor form. His retirement, seeing as there will not be an alternative place for him to take on the grid, seems the neatest all-round solution, rather than Red Bull being forced to axe him 2 years early. If you watched our video before the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend, you'll know that Williams driver Franco Colapinto is firmly on Red Bull's radar. Another team, understood to be Alpine, is also showing interest, although it's unclear exactly what for, given that team has Pierre Gasly and Jack Doohan confirmed for 2025. Red Bull's situation is more concrete, and its interest in someone else's junior driver makes sense if you consider a few key details. Red Bull has 2 seats to fill for next year. It doesn't think its own youngster Isaac Hadjar is ready for F1, and Williams is bringing in Carlos Sainz next year, so Colapinto doesn't have a full-time drive there beyond his cameo in place of Logan Sargent for the rest of 2024. Except it may be more than that. Colapinto's not just being considered as a Yuki Tsunoda teammate, there's a chance, however small, that he goes straight in at Red Bull Racing. Red Bull's been impressed by Colapinto's mentality as much as his speed against Alex Albon. The way he stepped into F1 last minute with very little preparation and been competitive straight away has really caught the eye. It showed a kind of steel and resilience that Red Bull thinks is essential for top drivers. So while it's unsure exactly how fast Colapinto is, he looks from afar to be pretty quick and aggressive. Senior Red Bull figures have told us that while an RB seat alongside Tsunoda would be most logical, there are still 3 races left to evaluate Liam Lawson and see how Colapinto finishes his season at Williams. So if Red Bull pulls the pin on chasing Colapinto properly, it would be with both its senior team and RB in mind. In Brazil, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner met with his Williams counterpart James Vowles. He was pictured leaving hospitality, which Vowles laughed off as Horner wanting to try some coffee from a new team partner. Vowles has been deliberately cagey about the exact nature of his team's recent talks with Red Bull. We'll digress very slightly here to make it clear that Red Bull's not trying to get hold of Sainz before he goes to Williams. That was a theory that did the rounds in the Interlagos paddock, and it's not going to happen. Red Bull has been terrible in the driver market recently, but even Red Bull's not prepared to pay an 8-figure sum to get hold of a driver who was a free agent just a few months ago and was desperately waiting for a Red Bull offer. Plus, Vowles has talked Sainz up so highly and worked so hard to sign him in the first place, there's surely no way he'd leave Williams so vulnerable at such a late stage in the driver market. So, to nobody's real surprise, the conversation between Horner and Vowles in Brazil was about Colapinto. He's on a long-term contract with Williams, one he had to sign to get this F1 opportunity for the rest of the year. Williams is currently holding out for a massive payday to release the young Argentinian driver. Whatever price Williams has set, it's miles beyond what Red Bull is willing to pay. We understand Red Bull would be willing to shell out a few $1 million, but Williams is thought to value Colapinto as much as 3 or 4 times higher than that amount. Maybe that's got something to do with the army of South American sponsors that have joined the team since Colapinto got in the car. But after he crashed twice in one day in Brazil, including under the safety car in the race, the price might have dropped a bit. Or Red Bull may raise an eyebrow over his top team suitability right now. Based on what we learned in Brazil, Colapinto has to be seriously considered in the Red Bull picture for 2025 alongside Lawson. Maybe Perez if Red Bull feels it has no other choice, and maybe Tsunoda, who had a very strong weekend in Brazil but is simply not a driver Horner rates highly enough. Finishing up with Colapinto, obviously someone does have to pay Williams to let him go. Either Williams drops the price, or Red Bull needs Colapinto's backers to foot the rest of the bill. An alternative is some assistance from a third party. As we explained last week, there is a connection between Colapinto and Perez's main supporter Carlos Slim, whose companies have real estate on Red Bull's cars as a result. What chance then that Slim switches allegiance to Colapinto? After all, what Williams is demanding might be off-putting to Red Bull, but it's chump change to a guy like Slim. Whatever happens with Colapinto though, Red Bull could yet go in a completely different direction when selecting Verstappen's 2025 teammate. And right now, the leading choice looks to be Lawson. Yes, he was second best to Tsunoda at Interlagos, but it was another new track for him, only his 3rd Grand Prix since replacing Daniel Ricciardo, and just his 8th F1 weekend in total. Horner was quick to point out Lawson had done a super job, talking him up ahead of Tsunoda specifically because of the experience gap. What was so impressive about Lawson in Brazil is that he always looked like a points threat. He was the lead RB driver in the sprint, in which he battled Pierre Gasly and Perez for a points finish before being relegated to 9th by the driver he wants to replace next year. That was their second on-track fight in less than a week, after a controversial race in Mexico, despite Perez being in a much faster car. And their third fight came 24 hours later when Lawson managed to beat Perez in the Grand Prix. They had another little clash in the race, one that left Perez far less angry this time, and frankly, it is bizarre for the two drivers to keep finding one another on track. That reflects far, far better on Lawson than it does Perez, not least because he's come out on top in 2 of the 3 fights. That seat alongside Verstappen might just be 3 more good races away.